Hello, I'm Dr. Hassan Tohid, and I'm here once again with a sensational topic as usual, the cross-sectional study. What are cross-sectional studies? Or what is a cross-sectional study? If you belong to the field of research, or if you are a student of research, you must have heard the word cross-sectional study. New students find it difficult to understand how to differentiate between different kinds of studies, and cross-sectional is one of those studies that bothers them. So let's talk about this. To understand the cross-sectional study, we need to understand the study design pyramid. The study design pyramid looks something like this. If you see in this picture, the cross-sectional studies are in the middle. Usually at the bottom are the in vitro studies, then the animal studies, then ideas, opinions, editorials, and then the case reports and case series, and then comes the cross-sectional studies. Now, if you see all of these names, starting with letter C, cross-sectional studies, case series, cohort studies, or case control studies, all of these are actually observational studies. So other than clinical trials, these C, any of these studies starting with letter C actually is observational study. So what do we mean by that? It means that we just observe. As a scientist, we just observe. We don't manipulate the environment. That is the observational study. And observational study are of different kinds. And cross-sectional studies are one of those. And they are also known as descriptive studies. So remember these terminologies. They are descriptive studies. They are also known as observational studies. And there is no intervention involved. You don't change the environment. Now, what else is about cross-sectional studies? You look at the prevalence of a problem, of a disease, the prevalence, and we call it as a snapshot. It is also known as a snapshot. So we study prevalence, we call it a snapshot, like taking an image, like just taking an image from camera. And we just want to see what is happening at one particular point in time. So in cross-sectional studies, we look at what is happening at one point in time. These are known as cross-sectional studies, and they can be usually done through surveys. So survey studies are actually cross-sectional studies. When you provide survey to the participants who will be the participants in your observational study, then it is known as a cross-sectional study if it is at one point in time. Now, let me make things easier for you. Remember, cross-sectional study is an observational study in which you just observe. You do not manipulate the environment. You just collect the data at one point in time. And if you do it at one point in time, if you do that at one point in time, then you call it a cross-sectional study. So observational study or descriptive study is a study in which you don't manipulate the environment. Cross-sectional study is one of the types of the observational study or the descriptive studies. You do not manipulate the environment. You just provide a survey, or you just observe them and you report what you found. Now, survey studies, because this is a survey study, right? Survey studies can be of two types. These descriptive studies can be of two types. We're talking about the survey studies. The survey studies can be of two types, cross-sectional and longitudinal study. You must have heard this word longitudinal study a lot, so don't get confused. I will make sure I finish this confusion today. Cross-sectional studies are when you observe what is happening at one point in time. Right now, for example, in the present, for example. Cross-sectional study, one point in time. But when you look at what is happening at multiple points in time, when you look at the things at multiple points in time, then you don't call it a cross-sectional study. You name it as a longitudinal study. So remember, one point in time is cross-sectional study. Multiple points in time is a longitudinal study. They both can be survey studies. And all the survey studies are descriptive studies, and they come under the big umbrella of observational study. I hope now you understand what is a cross-sectional study. Now remember, you must have participated in census of your country, national census, right? Where people come and they get information from you, how many people live in your home, or you provide a survey to the government, whether online, whether through mail, whatever process is there in your country. That is actually a cross-sectional study. Census is actually a cross-sectional study. The population, they are calculating the population. They are looking at what is happening right now, how many people live in our country, and they do it by survey. So remember, whenever you think of cross-sectional study, survey studies, think of the census the government does to calculate the number of people living in that particular country. So census is an example of cross-sectional study, and they are to check the prevalence of a problem or a disease. And they are also known as snapshots. In this study, you look at the prevailing characteristics of the population that you have collected. Usually you have one group. Remember, you don't have multiple groups in observational study like cross-sectional study. You will have multiple groups in cohort studies. You will have multiple groups in case control studies, but you don't have multiple groups in cross-sectional study. Now, I do know there are some cross-sectional studies in which you have multiple groups, in which you have two groups. Yet it can happen, but most of the time there is only one group, and it's a huge population of a city or a town or a country, and you look at them, what is happening, what are they doing right now. So this is how you do a cross-sectional study. Now, why do we do cross-sectional study? To look at the prevalence of a problem, not the incidence of a disease, not new cases. How many people are already there with this particular problem? Now, why do we do it? To save our time. It's not a long-term project, it's one point in time, because longitudinal study will be multiple points in time, so it can be long. Like cohort studies, they are long. Clinical trials, they can be long. But cross-sectional studies, you only need to collect data once. What is happening at one point in time? Is time savior, is money savior, is cheaper, is inexpensive, is faster, and you get your data. So that's why we do it. And another unique feature of cross-sectional studies is that here you don't look at the cause and effect relationship. You're just looking at a population, looking at a prevalence, like a snapshot, like a survey sample, or like census. Now, the sample selection. As we discussed before in my previous video, if you have seen the case study video or case series, the sampling in case series usually is done on the basis of the outcome or risk factor and outcome both. But outcome was always there. I hope you remember that. If you don't remember, then you go back to my video on the case series and you will revise what I discussed before. Now, in cohort studies, the sampling was done on the basis of risk factor. In cohort studies, the sampling was done on the basis of outcome. But in cross-sectional study, the sampling is usually done together of the risk factor and the outcome. So outcome based and risk factor both at the same time. And usually you collect the whole population by deciding a predetermined criteria as well. That's another way you can do your cross-sectional study. But just letting you know that this is how you can mainly differentiate. The differentiating feature is that here you do the data collection combined. The sample selection is combined on the basis of the outcome and risk factor both. In cohort, only risk factor was there. The sampling was done on the basis of risk factor. In case control, the sampling was done on the basis of outcome. In case series, the sampling was mostly done on the basis of outcome. In clinical trials, the sampling is mostly done on the basis of a predetermined criteria. You determine an inclusion-exclusion criteria in advance and you do the sampling. So in cross-sectional study, either you can do the predetermined criteria or you do the sampling on the basis of the outcome and risk factor together. So this is all about the cross-sectional study. And once you collect your survey, you create your survey questions, you have your survey questions done, you can do the Likert scale approach, Likert. I think that's the spelling, Likert scale. So Likert scale, you collect your data according to Likert scale, or you can use any of those approaches, the true and false questionnaire. You collect 10, you create 10 questions, 20 questions, or 100 questions, and you distribute to the participants, and you collect that information back. And then you start writing your project. So it will be very easy for you to write your project. And remember, the social media experiments that you see, most of the time they are observational study if there is no intervention. If you are just looking at what is happening at this one particular point in time. If the scientist has not manipulated the environment, they are usually the cross-sectional studies. They're looking at what is happening at one point in time without doing the intervention. The moment they do intervention, it becomes an interventional study or experimental study or the clinical trial. So just wanted to make sure that now you have clarity. And I'll quickly repeat again, cross-sectional studies are also known as descriptive studies because they are under the umbrella of observational studies. And you do that or do these kind of studies by the surveys. You distribute the surveys or you just observe and you report the findings. And they are also known as snapshots. And you look at the prevalence of a problem or a disease. And they are like the census of a country. And they are cheaper, inexpensive, time savior. And you cannot look at the cause and effect relationship in these studies. And the last thing is the sampling is done on the basis of outcome and risk factor together. So these are some unique features of a cross-sectional study. I hope you will remember that. And I recommend watch this video again and again and again until you grasp the concept of cross-sectional study. We'll meet again in another video. Keep learning, keep watching. Thank you.